Hello everybody, my name is Professor Rich, and today we are going to be watching a video from another channel. I'll be reacting to that video, and then, as usual, at the end of the class, we'll have time for any questions you have about what we've talked about today, or about learning English in general. So, hello to everyone who's joining us live. And yes, we have finally become a React channel. Does this mean that I'm out of ideas? Maybe. Okay, let's take a look here. So this is a video from LinguaMarina, and the video is about moving from intermediate to advanced. Now, of course, moving from intermediate to advanced is quite a big deal in English learning. Most English learners that you find on YouTube and even coming into classrooms tend to have some English. So it's actually quite rare to find a lot of beginners. You do find beginners, of course, but to find a school where the majority of English learners are beginners, that is quite rare. There's lots of pre-intermediates, intermediates, upper intermediates, and also, what do all those terms actually mean? I remember a student once telling me, Rich, I've been intermediate for 20 years. It's almost like you just always have these different levels of intermediate. Like someone's just too afraid to say that now you're advanced. And actually, when you're advanced, what does that mean? Because, as we've discussed before, there's C1 and then there's C1. And lots of people will go around, I have C1, and then they can't have a conversation with someone. And you think, well, is that C1? What's going on there? Of course, there's always problems with measuring language level. Just like measuring the level of anything, it gets to be complicated. Anyway, we are going to watch this video, and as we go, I'm going to give my thoughts. So let's begin. What's this all about?
Today, I will give you your study plan to go from intermediate to advanced in English. As a language learner who's been learning English for a number of years now, I understand that it's really hard to improve your language starting with upper intermediate, advanced, because those improvements are very nuanced and very detailed. Let me give you an example. When you just start learning a language, you start with basic phrases and it takes you a few weeks, and then you can...
I think we can see where she's going with this, and this probably is the primary thoughts that most people have on this issue. When you first start learning a language, you learn a couple of phrases, some verbs, and then you have your first conversation at some point in English, and it feels great. It's like, wow, now I can have a conversation in English. That's fantastic. It's very difficult. It's very basic, but it's like you have a little conversation and you feel great about it. And that could be from a relatively short amount of study. Of course, it depends where you start, but you could maybe study for a month or a few months and then go and talk to someone and have a basic conversation and feel great. And also you feel great the whole time because you're always learning new vocabulary and new grammar, and now I've got this and this and this, and you get this sense of progression. But then when you get to upper intermediate, advanced level, it can be very difficult to see progress. Because what does progress look like when you get to those levels? It's like these tiny changes, right? Like, oh, I keep making this small grammar mistake when I use the second conditional. Like, I keep putting have in the wrong place, right? Or I keep forgetting to use the past simple for one part of that. So it's these very kind of small changes that are very specific, not like a big difference, like, oh, now I can have a conversation. So that is actually one of the big challenges of continuing to improve your English as you get to upper intermediate and advanced. It's difficult to see the progress. And I think that's what she's going to say.
Can actually interact in language. You've learned 100 words and it seems like a lot of progress. But what if you're intermediate and you already know, say, 1,000 words in English? Adding 50 more words doesn't seem like a huge improvement. And this is where your motivation starts disappearing because we constantly need this dopamine. We constantly need to see our results to be happy with ourselves and continue studying. And I've been there so many times. So today, we're going to go through every section.
Yeah, and I think that pretty much applies to anything. That dopamine provides a great deal of motivation. Dopamine is the motivation neurochemical. There's a very interesting experiment which scientists did on rodents. I believe it was rats. And they removed the dopamine receptor from the brain, or they isolated dopamine in some way. And they found that without dopamine, the rats would not eat. Like they had no compulsion to go and eat food. However, this is the very strange part, right? However, if the scientists forced the food into the rats, they still seem to enjoy it. So they still got the serotonin and they still demonstrated enjoyment of eating. So isn't that so peculiar? Like, you take out dopamine and the rats, they don't have any motivation to go and eat the food, but they still enjoy it. So they enjoy eating, they know that they enjoy eating, but they don't do it without dopamine. That's really the power of dopamine, that even when you want to do something, without dopamine, you don't do it. It is the motivation chemical. And it's a big thing in learning, isn't it? A sense of progress. If you feel you're making progress, you get a dopamine hit. Actually, the reason why many of you are watching this stream now, and the reason why you are English learning enthusiasts, is probably because of dopamine. It's probably because you get a dopamine hit from learning English, from watching these streams, or from something like that. Dopamine also is the big chemical, the big neurochemical involved in sports, games, video games. Basically anything that you want to do, eating, drinking, sleeping, other things, dopamine's a big part of it. So that absolutely makes sense. And this sense of progression provides us with that dopamine. And then if it's more difficult to see our progress, to get the sense of progression, then obviously it becomes harder to find motivation.
Of the language, we're going to talk about reading, we're going to talk about vocabulary, grammar, and I will give you a list of things that you need to know in order to become advanced. I've created this list together with a teacher from California. Hi Lisa, thank you so much for helping me. But before we start, please like this video and subscribe to this channel if you're not yet subscribed. I'm gonna add a lot of commentary from myself because, oh my god, I just took another TOEFL test. We're waiting for the final results, but despite living in the US for 10 years, I still think that TOEFL is a very, very intense test.
Yeah, I mean, of course it is. And so TOEFL is basically the American equivalent of IELTS. IELTS is the sort of British Australian one, and then TOEFL is the kind of US one. But they are these international tests of language level. And honestly, the IELTS and the TOEFL, they are tests which would be challenging for anyone. I mean, the thing is, they don't only test language. They test kind of interpretation and meta skills related to language, like being able to represent data in charts and explain it. I mean, those skills are not strictly pure language skills, and you could easily find a guy on the street down the pub in England who would find that kind of question, that kind of exercise very difficult. So, yeah, of course, living in the US for 10 years, it's challenging. Living in the US for your whole life could still be challenging. I don't think anyone could do it in their sleep. So, yeah, of course. I wonder, by the way, if we did make native speakers take IELTS or TOEFL, would they get perfect scores? I doubt it, actually. I think unless they were prepared, I don't think they would naturally get perfect scores. So that's quite interesting when you think about it, isn't it? But I think it's still a very useful metric because we're not necessarily measuring language learning against natives anyway. We're really measuring language aptitude, language ability, and not only communicating as a native, but also the meta skills that I mentioned earlier.
Now, without further ado, we're going to transition to your vocabulary. And when I say that it gets harder and harder to get to the next level when you're closer to the top, I am not making this up. Let's look at the table that shows the number of learning hours you need to achieve each level from the level below.
This is pretty similar to the table that I refer to as well. Whenever a student asks me, how long will it take for me to get X, Y, Z? And I mean, the data is there, but it can be a little bit more complicated than it appears. So they have these ideas of guided learning. Guided learning means you with a teacher, basically. So that's how long you are in class. And then the idea is that you are also actively doing things outside of class. But there's lots of questions about that. Like, is there a difference between one-to-one and group classes? Like when we say guided learning, I mean, this chart doesn't differentiate. So it'll just say like 300 to 400, right? That's to get from C1 to C2, they say, 400 hours of lessons. And like, what about if you have 5 lessons a week or 1 lesson a week? What about if you have a break of learning for 6 months? There's all kinds of considerations. So you have to realize that this is basically taking an average of everything. So we're not considering exceptional circumstances. And quite honestly, in my experience, I think it takes longer than the chart says. And I think probably the reason for that is because many students will take large breaks in their learning, or they will get a bit worn out and stop doing so much outside of class. So actually, I think that these tables tend to be quite optimistic. And I think they're more likely to apply to younger learners who can dedicate a lot into the learning. So say a teenager who's coming to an intensive summer school might be able to look at a chart like this and say, yes, this is, this may well apply to them. And maybe if they come into the summer school at A2, then we could say, you're going to leave at B1 if you're studying, 4 hours of class time a day, 4 times a week for 10 weeks. So a very long and intensive summer course could potentially get a teenager from A2 to B1. But anyway, I often also refer to these charts because how else can you answer the question, without saying, it depends, it depends, it depends, it depends. You know, it depends on so many things. And also natural language ability, which does exist. We call language aptitude. There are a variety of ways of measuring it. It's a horrible test, by the way, the kind of new one. I tried it. It involves memorizing invented words and things like that. It's really horrible. Oh, I can't stand it. So obviously my language learning aptitude is very low. So yes, there's also natural ability. Some people are good at this stuff.
Below. So for example, if you're at B1 now, you will need at least 180 hours to become B2. But if you're at C1 level and you want to become C2, almost a native speaker, you need at least 300 hours. And at this level, we're talking accent. We're talking pronunciation of the most advanced words. If we convert that into weeks, you need at least 40 weeks to get from B1 to B2, but you need at least 75 weeks to go from C1 to C2. And this is where I tell you, brace yourself. Because yes, it's gonna get harder. At my level, for example, C1, C2, I am working with academic vocabulary. I'm working with idioms that are not used in our everyday lives. I'm working with those tiny details, and there are so many of those. Okay, now that you understand that this transition is gonna require some work, now you're ready. Now let's talk about things that you...
Interesting little point about idioms, by the way, is that the older someone is, as a native speaker, the more idioms they use as part of their everyday language. So as we get older, we actually use more idioms. That kind of makes sense, actually, in that the younger you are, the more you apply generalizations in order to generate the language that you use. So in order to formulate the language you use, then you apply more rules. But as you get older, you get more and more exposure to lots of different language. And therefore, you get more familiar with language which you can only learn through experience. In other words, you can't use a rule to generate an idiom by definition, right? Idiom means it doesn't make sense from the parts. So you can't put the parts together and apply rules and make the idiom, right? The idiom is just a fixed phrase at the very extreme idiomatic level. It's a fixed phrase which you need to learn through exposure to the language. So as we get older, we become more familiar with more and more of these, and we become more comfortable using them. This also displays how first language will enter into our passive vocabulary, because of course young people will often understand most idioms. Occasionally you find an old person says something weird and you're like, what did you just say? Like some weird idiom from the 1950s, right? And you're like, what is that? You kind of need to ask someone what it means. That does happen. That does happen, especially with regional idioms. But in general, young people will understand all the idioms, but will only use them more as they get older. So this sort of also shows how first comes the passive understanding of language, and then later comes use.
Actually need to become advanced. And the first aspect that we're going to talk about is reading. And when it comes to reading, there are several aspects that you need to be able to understand. Text from many genres, dealing with a wide range of subjects. Doesn't matter if you understand the subjects or not. So for example, I just took the TOEFL test, and in the reading part, I had several texts. One text was about mammals and the sea and the ocean. The second text was about economics. The third text was also related to science. And there were some terms that I did not know beforehand. And there was so many nuances and details. But if you want to score the highest grade on tests like TOEFL, IELTS, and other English language tests, you need to be able to understand texts about anything. Very complicated academic texts. So I'm adding academic.
Yeah, I kind of wondered what she meant by genres there. Because initially I thought, oh, what are we talking about when we say genres, like fiction and non-fiction and stuff like that. But actually, she was talking about domains. So whether we're reading texts about science or texts about the environment or about transport. So yeah, this is the idea of having domain-specific vocabulary versus domain general vocabulary. Domain-specific vocabulary is extremely difficult to build up in all domains. Of course, it is a measure of your ability with the language to be able to know a lot of domain-specific vocabulary, so that you know vocabulary from marine biology and you know vocabulary from cyber technology, right? And you know vocabulary from household items, right? So that you know bits of vocabulary, but also a measure of your ability as a non-native language speaker, user, is how you cope with unknown vocabulary. So it's how you deal with reading a text about a forest and seeing some words like bark and pine cone and acorn and trying to deal with that. How do you deal with that? When you read a phrase like the browning oak bark crunched under my footstep, how do you deal with something like that in context? That sentence I just gave you could be very difficult for you because I haven't presented the whole context. In an exam, obviously, you have the text, you can get into it, you can tune in to the topic, and then you can try to deal with the unknown vocabulary that you have. So, and I would argue that that's a more important skill to develop, actually, than kind of reading and memorizing vocabulary. And maybe she'll talk about that.
Vocabulary here. Now, there are several ways to improve your reading, but obviously you need to read a lot, and this is the time for you to start switching to more advanced resources. So look at texts from magazines like Time, National Geographic, The Economist, Vogue, Self, Men's Health, The New Yorker, and The Guardian. Those articles are advanced and they're going to be great for your reading practice.
Yeah, I mean, you know that my standard advice is always to go with your interest. So if you have an interest in reading those sorts of things, I think that's absolutely fantastic. There is a bit of bias when it comes to the language learning exams. So if you are actually looking at an IELTS or TOEFL exam, then that sort of media probably is quite advantageous, because often you will find that the texts used in exams are adapted from exactly those kinds of sources. The exam writers tend to be these kind of liberal arts-minded readers who will read The Guardian, the BBC, Reuters, New York Times, and those sorts of publications. And so familiarizing yourself with those. National Geographic is also a good one. However, if you are prepping an exam, my advice actually would be rather to just focus on exam practice and strategy. And if you're not prepping an exam, then I would say go where your interest is. So first question, do you enjoy reading in your own language? Yes or no? If the answer is yes, congratulations, you have an advantage in learning reading in English. You should then read in English, and your target should be to find texts that you enjoy. Now, Marina here is recommending to read widely, and that's great for people who can find a wide range of topics which they enjoy. But, you know, not everyone is a reader. And it is possible to be a competent language learner without being a reader. My dad, for example, really does not enjoy reading. He only does it when he has to. But he's got half decent German. He studied German classes, I think, just for a year or two. And he can make a few sentences, phrases. And he quite likes the grammar and the pronunciation as well. So he can talk about the grammar and pronunciation. He finds it quite interesting. But you would never get him to read things in German as like a fun or even a study activity, I don't think. So certainly not necessary. Play to your strengths. But obviously, if you do enjoy it, then it's a great thing to do. I mean, that is playing to your strength. And of course, it is an advantage because it's another source of language. But also, I would argue if you enjoy video games, that's a massive advantage. People I know who play video games online learning English, you can really see, especially in the kind of colloquial language and phrases and things like that, they really pick up a lot of that stuff. So you can use different things to your advantage.
Number 2, listening. Oh my goodness. Because I just took TOEFL, I'm going to give you a lot of examples from an advanced English language test. When it comes to listening, you need to be able to understand sarcastic sentences. You need to...
Sorry, I need to pause a moment. Tetsuro says, I bought some video games you recommended. Are you serious, Tetsuro? What did you buy? Can you tell me? I'm super interested about that. I love video games, and I would love to do more stuff on it, but it tends to be surprisingly unpopular on my channel. Like, people show a little bit of interest, but I think most people who watch the channel are interested in it as kind of a curiosity, but I don't think they want to really play it. Oh, you bought the Sherlock Holmes game. Is that Crime and Punishment? Sherlock Holmes Crime and Punishment. That game is fantastic. And the voice acting by, what's the guy's name? Kerry something or Sherry something. The guy who plays Sherlock Holmes in that, he does an amazing Sherlock Holmes. And I remember I listened to his native accent, and he's not British. And it blew me away because I think his Sherlock Holmes is just so good. Later on in the series, they changed the voice actor, and I couldn't play the games. I just didn't enjoy them at all. But that game, Sherlock Holmes, Crime and Punishment, that is so enjoyable. I love that game.
To be able to understand idioms. You need to be able to understand which information actually matters and what information was secondary information. You need to learn how to pay attention to the right things and also be able to understand accents, idioms, dialects. That is all part of advanced listening.
Yeah, absolutely. And that applies not only to exams, but also to real life. Actually, the exams are a bit behind in this aspect. So it's taken a while for formal exams to start using more accents. In the past, in the kind of 80s and 90s, exams would have this kind of BBC RP accent, you know? Hello, what can you tell us about marine biology? And over time, they've incorporated more and more regional accents. And then in the last decade, we've seen non-native accents come into it finally. And that really makes sense. That really makes sense. There's a lot of complaints from learners about non-native accents, and these fights will go on forever. You know, I don't like this accent, I don't like that accent, that's not how you say it in English, blah, blah, blah. But the reality is, this language is the lingua franca of the world. It is the language that we use to communicate with everyone. And so if you want to say that you are a highly advanced speaker and listener of English, you need to be able to cope with German accents, Swedish accents, Indian accents, Chinese accents, right? And I need to as well, right? As a native speaker. Like, if I stay in my little local bubble community and I don't speak to any, I'm not going to speak to those foreigners, right? And I find it difficult to communicate, then, you know, that says something bad about my language, even if I am a native, right? I should still have the ability to communicate. That is what we're measuring with language, right? It's the ability to communicate. So you can still be a bad communicator, even if it's your born language. And that applies to other languages as well. You know, I've heard people complaining in other languages about how non-natives will speak their language. And it's like, come on, you know, you have to be charitable. You have to be a bit charitable, okay? Especially in English, because it's everywhere and you can't control it. That's difficult. Hey, it's frustrating for me as well sometimes, you know? It's frustrating for everyone, but we have to learn to be good communicators where we can understand as well as speak.
There we go. Accents. Again, advanced vocabulary. I would write priorities, but basically understand what's important, what's not. And we're going to talk about grammar later in this video. But
yeah, so priorities, identifying key information, isn't it? That is fundamental to listening. Natural, powerful, fluent listening does not involve concentration on each word. That is not how people listen. It's not how natives listen. It's not how non-natives should listen. We listen for information. We don't listen for isolated words. What actually happens is we hear key information and we fill in a lot of the other words subconsciously. Now, as a non-native, that can be difficult because your subconscious or your procedural memory system won't be as developed in that language. And so you have to consciously do it. You have to use your declarative. That means you have to actually concentrate more on words which a native speaker wouldn't have to focus on at all because they'll be filled in automatically by the subconscious, right? We can make assumptions because we're so familiar with the language. You might have seen online on social media, people make these posts where they post words and you have the first letter and the last letter of the word, and then the letters in the middle are mixed, right? And you can read the message even though the letters in the middle are mixed. And that's a demonstration of how our minds can process language without having all the little pieces. We can still process it. And that's essentially the same thing that's happening when you're listening. So this idea of identifying the message, the key information, the critical parts of the speech, that's important. That's really important. And any good language learning course or language learning course book will include a focus on that subskill, the subskill of identifying key information when you're listening. It's a really important skill to develop.
People love to use conditionals, and you need to understand what they actually mean. So how do you practice listening? Through podcasts. I wish they existed 20 years ago when I was actively learning English, because podcasts give us such a great variety of accents and views. I like Lex Friedman's podcast. I like Andrew Huberman's podcast. And of course, movies and TV shows.
Hey, they're good recommendations. I'm not a big fan of Lex Friedman myself. I find him, I think he's self-confessed autistic and or something. I'm a little bit autistic myself, honestly, but I just find his analytical style a little bit challenging at times. Personally, I would go Andrew Huberman as well. I've listened to a few times. Personally, I'd go with Joe Rogan. I'm a big Joe Rogan fan. What are those podcasts about? They're about all kinds. See, Joe Rogan, who is the biggest podcaster in the world, he started this trend of basically having multifaceted podcasts. So these are podcasts which cover a wide range of subjects. So he will have on a nutritionist, and then a comedian, and then an MMA fighter, and then a politician, and then a journalist, right? And he goes through all these different areas. And then like Neil deGrasse Tyson, the physicist, the astrophysicist. So it's just like everything, right? Everything. Almost like the Renaissance man of podcasting. And this has kind of started a trend now, where people have podcasts with these kind of very broad coverage. People really like podcasts. I love listening to podcasts. I listen to them all the time. And let's be honest, it's probably better than watching 10 series of Friends, right? It's probably better because you actually learn stuff with podcasts. Although you should, of course, take the information with a piece of salt. A piece of salt? That's a good example of a new idiom. You should take it with a pinch of salt, because although they are often experts, we are just talking about people on the internet. But, you know my perspective. I think we should be skeptical of all the information that we listen to and make our own decisions. Podcasts are still great fun anyway. I highly recommend it. I mean, it's just something that you're engaging with and you're listening to and you're practicing and you're enjoying it. I mean, if you're listening to me now and kind of enjoying this, perfect, right? Okay, I don't have a podcast guest, unfortunately. This is a monodialogic podcast with I suppose I have a passive podcast guest, but I've never heard anyone ever say that before, so I just invented that. But yeah, I'd recommend Joe Rogan. That's difficult though. We're talking very high levels. You'd have to be into C2 really to enjoy Joe Rogan, I think. Maybe Lex Friedman is better because I think he does have a kind of measured, slower and careful way of speaking, which could be helpful for language learners. Just find podcast that you enjoy and you can understand.
Those would definitely help you with listening. Emily in Paris, this TV show is kind of easier to understand, but I would highly recommend it anyways. They have such a beautiful vocabulary there. They use a lot of idioms, they use a lot of comparisons. Their speech is strikingly beautiful in that TV show.
Always nice to make recommendations. That's not my cup of tea.
At least for me. The Hunger Games, The Little Things, Big Little Lies. If you're interested in a place where I live, Big Little Lies.
Yeah, me and Marina have very different tastes in series. But I guess you know that from the things I've recommended in the past.
Lies was filmed very close to the Bay Area. The Social Network, Better Call Saul.
Well, I can agree with that one. These are really advanced things that she's recommending, though, I have to say. I think you'd need a good level of comprehension to really follow these. Better Call Saul is fantastic. Of course, it's probably better if you watch Breaking Bad first. Could you watch Better Call Saul without seeing Breaking Bad? I suppose you could, but you'd get some spoilers, I think, for Breaking Bad. And Breaking Bad is possibly the best TV series, at least in the last 20 years. Maybe the best written TV series ever. I don't know. Breaking Bad is fantastic. But then we're talking about very high levels of comprehension and also quite adult topics. So, kids, don't do it. Kids are lucky because there's loads of stuff for kids anyway. So if you're I know I have some teenagers who watch. If you're like 13 or 14, there's plenty of great things for you to watch. Like Adventure Time. And if you're a bit younger, Phineas and Ferb.
And some of the other shows. Now, the third aspect that you need to be working on is, of course, writing. Now here, let's look at what TOEFL test makers actually want you to be able to do if you want to qualify for the C1 level. Produce clear, well-developed, and well-organized.
Good job, Marina, pulling up the rubric. I think it's always good to focus on these written qualifiers of what learners are expected to do at the level. And when the examination bodies are writing these rubrics, they spend a lot of time in a committee working through these language specifications. So it's really important to have a good understanding of what the expectation is.
Text. That means that every thought has its own paragraph. That means you have an introduction. That means you have a conclusion. That means you use a lot of linking words like, in my opinion, however, furthermore, the speaker stated that, the speaker mentioned that. So I am writing here well-structured texts that include paragraphs, linking words. Of course, the use of advanced vocabulary, meaning idioms, C1 level words, and phrases. Also, when you're writing a text and you want to qualify as C1, you need to select important information from multiple sources, integrated and presented coherently and clearly in writing, with only occasional minor imprecision in the summary of the source information. What they basically mean is that, yes, you can summarize with your own words, but you have to be attentive to detail. You have to be very clear with what you're writing. By the way, when it comes to tests, they actually allow you to make minor mistakes. So if you're typing, if it's a typo, or maybe you didn't know how to spell the word correctly, that's fine. But of course, don't make too many mistakes. I'm just saying that because I want you to relax and stop trying to be perfect. Now,
it's funny. I find myself saying exactly that quite a lot because it's sort of natural as a learner to focus heavily on your mistakes. But you have to understand that mistakes are part of a natural process. And at higher levels, actually, it becomes quite difficult sometimes to distinguish mistakes from creative language use, to the extent that examiners will argue or discuss with each other about whether to mark something as whether to consider something, not mark it, because you don't mark mistakes, right? That's that almost all of these exams operate with positive marking. So it's not what you can't do, it's what you can do, right? But examiners will discuss about whether something is a demonstration of accurate use or not. And that can actually get quite difficult at more advanced levels, because really something which appears to be a mistake could actually be an example of someone taking ownership of the language and using it in a creative way, right? It's kind of like, imagine that someone was a guitar player, right? And you would say, well, as a guitar player, you know, this finger needs to be on the low E, the one that goes dong, right? So when you hold the guitar, you hold it like this here, and this left hand, right, this finger is kind of at the top on the dong, and this little finger is on the one that goes like ding at the bottom, right? Dong, ding, right? Something like that. Now, you might then say, well, if someone has their hand position different to that, then that's a mistake, right? You could say that. However, Jimi Hendrix had his guitar upside down. Jimi Hendrix. So he was left-handed, actually, so it'd be the other way, and he used a right-handed guitar upside down. So his finger here was on the high string, ding, and his little finger was on the dong. So he had the guitar upside down. So is that a mistake? Well, it's Jimi Hendrix. You know what I mean? Like, who's going to say that Jimi Hendrix is making a mistake there? And you can see similar things with languages, can't you? Shakespeare invented 1,000 words or whatever. So obviously, I'm not telling you to go into an exam and start inventing words. But I am saying that at some point, what could be seen as a mistake becomes creative use. And with that in mind, you have to realize the emphasis is not on precision, but it's on sophisticated communication. And so at some point, it becomes not so clear what exactly is a mistake. And if your ability to write and communicate is high enough, then those sorts of things won't matter anymore. And in fact, things that you might think are not or are strictly errors or mistakes actually don't look like mistakes anymore. But anyway, the most important thing, don't focus on mistakes. Totally agree. And then there's also the proviso. Obviously, don't go into the exam and make loads of mistakes, right? But don't really worry about it. You don't get penalized for the few mistakes here and there, typos or whatever. These are very minor things, really. And the examiners are looking more at what you can do. So can you display an excellent control of advanced structures? And you can do that whilst making a few spelling mistakes. That doesn't impact your ability to display an excellent control of advanced structures.
How can you challenge yourself with advanced writing? Something I can recommend is writing a review. As a creator, sometimes I go to places like hotels and they ask me as part of our collaboration to leave a review. And this is where I have to start with my general thoughts. Overall, this experience has been one of the best so far. There are several reasons, and then different paragraphs. Number 1, I really enjoyed the view from my room. Number 2, the service was amazing. Number 3, I'm simplifying this for you, but this basically shows the structure. So try writing a review on a platform like Yelp or Google Reviews. That's going to help you. That's going to help you practice that advanced writing. And of course, if you have any tests coming up, the best way to practice, the best way to get ready for the test is to go and take the mock test and see what's going on. Another way to practice all of your skills, especially listening, is to take an English language course. And the course that we've developed at LinguaTrip is called From Intermediate to Advanced. And when our teachers were working on it,
I love Monday.com.
What's Monday.com?
You don't know.
Oh, that's a little unfair, isn't it? Just as Marina's doing her advertisement, YouTube puts an advertisement right on top. That seems like a little bit unfair to me. We'll listen to her.
Extra attention to this plateau effect when you're already intermediate but you can't see any growth. And because the teachers in that course are native speakers or non-native speakers whose accent is almost perfect, you will get exposure to a variety of teachers, thus
Kind of a shame that she has to say that. I feel sorry for non-native teachers because they work so hard, and you can get some just amazing non-native teachers. But in terms of marketing, there is just an obsession with having that native model. And that's just how things are. But hey, you know, marketing sometimes works for us and sometimes works against us. I'm terrible at marketing.
practice your listening. That course includes 40 lessons on the most important English topics. There are some of my classes, mostly motivating and talking about my own experience and life hacks that can help you improve your language learning journey. There is, of course, Vania, our accredited teacher from Los Angeles. And there's Angela, who's a native speaker who's been teaching English for a while now. She's also an expert in methodology, and she creates programs for English language programs worldwide. We have level tests before and after the course so you can see your progress. And of course, we try to make your learning process as interesting and as entertaining as possible. Over 10,000 students have already taken courses with LinguaTrip, and I hope you join them as well. Also, if you decide to take this course with a group, and the next group starts on April 12th, and if you're watching this video after April 12th, check the link down below for the next start date. So basically, if you're taking it together with a group, we're gonna match you with people from all over the world so you can practice together. The link will be down below. I will be very excited if you take that course to speed up your way to
Free
the
advertisement
advanced level in English. Now let's move on and
since
talk
I'm reacting
about...
to her video, I think I should let the ad play out, right? Looks good. A little bit jealous, to be honest with you, Marina.
Speaking. Oh, this one is the most challenging, honestly, for me, because especially when you take a test or when you interact with a native speaker for the first time. I remember I was shaking when I was talking to a native speaker just because I thought they're judging me. They are judging my English. They think I'm dumb. All the time.
Yeah, I think pretty much everyone can relate to that, right? Like I also feel just like that speaking another language. You know, you do feel a little bit nervous, particularly when you're speaking to a native speaker, you know, and also if you're speaking to a teacher sometimes. I had a student who was so nervous speaking to a teacher for the first time, and she's been a student now for a couple of years and has got a lot more comfortable with that. That's actually one of the things which I think private conversation classes can really help with is it can really improve your confidence speaking to native speakers. So if you'd like to take classes with me, you can email me at professorrich@gmail.com, and you can find the email down below the video. What did Vitelli say? Vitelli says, I wouldn't watch her content even if you paid me, thanks. She's an influencer passing herself off as an English teacher, full stop. So I don't want to be mean about this. Of course, Marina has a massive channel. I'm sure she's not going to care anyway. But I think it's very difficult to be like a big YouTube star without also becoming this sort of influencer, right? So I don't know a lot about LinguaMarina, but from this video, it seems to me that what she's saying is quite true. I don't think I've disagreed with anything that she's said so far. There might be some extra details you can throw in here and there, but hey, it's a YouTube video, you know? So I don't know, Vitelli. In this video, I'm not seeing that, apart from maybe the Instagram profile at the start. I'm not seeing that. I'm seeing decent advice, which could be helpful. And there certainly are YouTube channels out there which are more in this vein of influencer that don't necessarily offer good advice. And I think I famously said in the past about one channel that they offered advice that was damaging. I'm not seeing any of that here. And the other thing is, something I particularly notice about Marina is she's speaking naturally. And that's more than can be said for a lot of English learning channels out there. So I just want to be fair, and that's just my opinion.
It kind of never goes away. It stays with you. This feeling that you're not a native speaker. Yesterday I was at a dinner. Almost everyone there was either a native speaker or moved to the US when they were kids. They graduated from American schools. And, sometimes there are things that they discuss that I don't understand just because I'm not part of that culture. I only immigrated when I was 25.
I think that's a really good point that she's made there about like how you can be in a group discussion and not really understand what someone's saying because you're not part of that culture. And I think that it's an important point to make, because you might be in a discussion and find it so difficult to understand and think, oh, my language is terrible, right? Like my English is terrible, or in my case, my Spanish is terrible. But actually it can be that you're just not part of that cultural pocket. And culture can be applied to a group of friends who know each other really well, and so they're talking about very specific things, or a region of a country, or a country. I could go and join a dinner table conversation with a group of Texans in the southern United States, and I might find it quite difficult to understand what they're talking about at first, because you don't have that cultural context, and it might take a while to tune in. So I think that's a really good point.
Basically born and raised in a different country, but at the same time I realize how inclusive the American society is, and if you're doing something interesting, people are willing to interact with you. So this fear never goes away, but it gets better. So when it comes to speaking, you guys are actually lucky. You have AI these days, and you can totally talk with AI. Well, for example, the paid version of ChatGPT allows you to interact with it in English. There are other different websites like SpeechAce or speakandimprove.com LinguaMarina.com that you can use to practice English. I'm going to leave all the links below. Now here, basically my advice will be practice. And the other thing,
paid version of ChatGPT is still the best in my opinion, but there certainly have been advancements from other AI, and I think in particular I've seen some interesting stuff from Grok, which is Elon Musk's AI recently, but I think OpenAI are still the leaders. Still, it's ChatGPT, paid version. That's the in the UK it's £20 per month, I believe, but the one that's like £100 per month, the ultra premium or whatever, I don't. That doesn't seem to be worth it to me. We've got some questions here. Liam says, "Who is she? Is she similar with Asian?" I don't think she's Asian, Liam. I don't know. I'm guessing that she's Mediterranean, but I don't know. With a name like Mogiliko, I'm not sure. She should teach on Zoom. I don't think she needs to teach on anything because she's a massive YouTube channel with a teaching business. So I think she's more, a YouTube influencer with teaching business. But she seems to me like someone who knows quite a bit about it, which that's the point really that I'm making here. This is why I think it seems like quite a good video. I can't speak for all her videos, but this is the only one I've watched. And it seems good to me. But I'll tell you how it is. You know, I have no reason to be especially nice here. I'll quite happily be critical, but what I'm seeing here is decent advice.
thing as a non-native speaker, try incorporating new words as soon as you can. So you've learned something, like it happens to me all the time. I learned something and I'm like, okay, great word. And I forget about it. If you start incorporating those words into your speech as soon as possible, there's more probability you're actually going to remember and use those words. Now let's talk about...
Yeah, I think making an active effort to incorporate phrases in particular into your speech, obviously that's great. But also I think that often that process is steered by your interest. So what you'll find is that when you notice new phrases and vocabulary, then some things will stick with you and then you will want to use them. So it's kind of like the vocabulary you discover that you like, you will naturally want to use, and you will start to incorporate that into your spoken vocabulary. So there's an element there that I would add to what she said, because she's saying like, learn something and then incorporate it. And I'm saying, as you find new vocabulary, the things that stand out to you, that you find interesting and you like, incorporate them. So I'm just giving you some guidance on selection, basically. So it's not just like you take everything, but you kind of naturally allow your interest to gravitate to certain things, take them, go with that.
My favorite. People are always like, Marina, but how many words do I know to be advanced in English? Now, there you go. The Common European Framework of Reference states that B1 requires 2,000 to 3,000 words.
I hate these kind of things. I think they're really not that useful. The only thing that's useful about this, and we can see by her expression, I think she probably agrees, the only thing that's really useful about this is deflecting questions from students about how many words you need to know. because it's not really a useful question. And that's not really how we're going to learn our language anyway. It's not like we're going to have this great list of words and then forcefully memorize a certain number and then we'll get to a certain level, you know? So these sorts of questions maybe are not that useful. And yeah, maybe this is what she'll say now.
At advanced level, you need 5,000 to 6,000 words. How does that sound? Sounds overwhelming. I agree. There is nothing you can really do except just learn those words. So there is actually a test that you can take. If you go to lextutor.com, they have a test for 2,000 level, 3,000 level, 5,000 level. Of course, they're not gonna ask you all of those words, but they took some of the brightest examples from the category and you're gonna be able to just test yourself. They also have a university word list and they have a 10,000 level word list. Just go ahead, take that test and see how you feel. Of course, it's an estimate. Of course, it's not 100% accurate, but I feel like it's a cool place to start. They have all kinds of different tests on their website. I like it a lot. Go to lextutor.ca, check them out. Now, what are the...
I just don't think that measuring your vocabulary in a quantitative way like that is particularly useful, because there's so much there's so much complexity to that. So there are many, like if you learn the word strong and strength and strengthen and things like that, like the word family of strong, does that count as one, or are we counting every morpheme variant also, or every, whatever you want to call it, variant of the word by different graphemes or whatever, right? The word family. Is that one? And also, what does it mean that we know that word? Is it that we can recognize it? Is it that we know the main definition? Do we know the top 3 definitions in the dictionary? Do we know the pronunciation? Can we hear it, see it, say it accurately? Can we use it in connected speech? Do we know the context? Do we know the phrases? Do we know the antonyms, the synonyms, and we can go on and on and on. The point is, I really don't like the idea of measuring vocabulary quantitatively, because we miss out on the quality. And quality is an important aspect of vocabulary. There's being able to say a word, and then there's being able to contextually use vocabulary flexibly in an accurate way. Right? So I would just try to get away from the idea of quantitatively learning vocabulary. I also think that thinking of vocabulary in terms of how many words you know steers you towards this kind of memorization of word lists and things like that. And although memorization is an important part of learning vocabulary, I think a lot of dedicated students focus too much on that. And what you find is you memorize these huge word lists and then forget 75% of them and can't use them, and so on and so on. So we want to really focus a bit more on the depth of our learning. We want to be learning with quality. So learning and using the vocabulary that we feel a connection to, that we like, and that we want to incorporate into the way we speak.
Other traits of advanced English language students' vocabulary.
Hey, business owner, why is selling?
Did I turn off my
Word
blocker?
combinations like a surge of anger, heavy rain, volcanic eruption.
She calls them word combinations. So this is what I would call collocations or phrases, and these are critical.
Advanced synonyms. Let's look at the example. I think it was my second year in uni when I finally learned how to be a good student. I think it was in my second year in uni when I finally got the hang of being a student. Oh, that's a nice expression. Cambridge Dictionary, British, by the way, says that that's a C1 phrase. Or instead of saying, do you still want to play tennis tonight? You can say, are we still on for tonight? Now, those words and phrases are the advanced level. In our intermediate to advanced course, we pay a lot of attention to such words and phrases.
See, she knows what she's talking about. Like this is good stuff, though, because we're on to our collocations and phrases now, which is really it is really the central piece of my own teaching, is about learning these useful phrases and being able to use them flexibly. So I think she's making a good point.
Okay, now let's talk about grammar. I know. Some people are like, but Marina, can I just learn 3 tenses? That's it. Nah, when you...
Interesting. I tend to have the opposite battle with my students. They always want to learn more grammar. But apparently she finds students who don't want to learn a lot of grammar. Send them my way, Marina. I'm happy to take students who don't want to learn grammar. I love grammar, by the way, and I love talking about it, and I love doing lessons on grammar. It's great. I'm just not very... In fact, I'm quite certain that studying a lot of rule-based grammar, spending too much time on it, is not that useful. And really what we need is useful practice activities which allow immediate feedback, particularly immediate positive feedback about correct use. And also, as I've said before, I think that grammar should be learnt phrasally first and foremost, and then you can learn the rules as a kind of editorial support. What that means is you can use the rules to monitor and check your own language. But when you're speaking, primarily, you should lean into those kind of natural phrases. If it weren't for this, I'd do something else. If it weren't for grammar, I'd celebrate with a martini. Right? If it weren't for this, So that's just a little example of a phrase to use for a second conditional. And if you become comfortable using that naturally, then you'll start to procedurally learn the grammar, which is much more important for your fluency and for your expression than learning the rules. Let's see what she says. Oh, what does Vitelli say? There are 3 tenses, by the way: present, past, future. Well, when I studied my CELTA, my Cambridge English Language Teaching for Adults, in 2012, I was told that in English there are only 2 tenses, I believe, or 3. Yeah, I believe it's 3 actually, and that's the past, the third person, and the infinitive. But I don't think the infinitive is the tense. So actually there's just 2, the past and the third person. That's what I was told. Now, I don't think most people agree with that. and you won't find that in any grammar books. But that's what she said. That's my tutor on the CELTA course. And then you have aspects, which are like the perfect tenses. And then you have modal expressions, which are like your things with will, may, could, and so on. But then you've got these things like gonna. And gonna is like a super common way of talking about the future. So if we don't call that a tense, that makes things very complicated. Over time, I've changed my position on this. My current position is to just make it simple and say, yeah, okay, we got our future tense, we got our future continuous, we got the past perfect, we got the past. Just call them tenses. Fine. I give up. I definitely don't subscribe to the idea of the 12 tenses. I mean, that it's as true to say there's 12 as it is to say that there's 2, because it just depends on how you analyze it. But I do think that those terms, future perfect continuous, I think they are useful to some extent. So let's not argue about what tenses there are. Really, what's more important is focusing on function. So the function is, what does this thing mean? Why do I use this? So if I say, for example, by Sunday, I'll have finished my homework. What is the function of saying I'll have plus participle by plus time period? I'll have by I'll have finished my PhD by 2027. I'll have cleaned my room by 7 p.m. tonight. What is the function of I'll have plus participle plus by plus time period? So the function is you express a completed action in the future. So that's where your focus should be. You're learning these structures, phrasal structures, and you're attaching them to functions. That's how I analyze the language. Let's see what Marina says. If we disagree anywhere, it's going to be here, surely. And I disagreed a little bit with vocabulary, actually. So we had our first disagreement over vocabulary. What about grammar, Marina? Take it away.
When you come to the US, people use all kinds of tenses, all kinds of structures, and if you don't understand their meaning, sometimes you can get confused. And I'm sorry, the lighting is kind of weird today. It is really windy, so clouds come and go, and sometimes the sun is shining brightly in my studio, but then the next second it's gone and it's all gray. But yeah, the reality of living in California. Of course, when you are an advanced English language learner, you know all the 12 tenses. We're not going to talk about that. What we're going to talk about are those nuanced details, like inversion. You need to understand how to use it and what it means. Here comes the trouble. See, inversion in the word order is used to highlight our emotions. The action comes first, and who or what does the action comes second. Not only did Sheldon save my life, he didn't rat me out to the landlord or the police, Homeland Security. Conditionals. Not only your regular conditionals, but also mixed conditionals. I remember when we were learning that at school, I was so tired of conditionals, and then they say, oh, but you know, we just learned all the rules. Sometimes they do not apply or apply in a different way when it comes to mixed conditionals. I'm like, come on. Why so complicated? So when you were at intermediate level, you've learned 0, first, second, and third conditionals. But at advanced level, you have to be familiar with mixed conditionals. Let me show you an example. You create sentences with a past condition and a present or future result, or the other way around. Let's look at type 1, present results of a past action. If I had worked harder at school, I would have a better job now. So the structure is if plus past perfect, and in the second sentence we have would plus infinitive. Type 2, past result of present condition. Here is an example from the movie. Oh my God, I just met that actor. A couple months ago, he was presenting a book here in the Bay Area. I mean, I read it on a cruise, and if I wasn't afraid it was an environmental hazard, I would have tossed it overboard. And the structure is if plus past simple would have plus
I'm not certain this is a good example, and I don't want to pick on this too much. Sorry for pausing a little bit. I had to think. I think this, from my perception, this may not be the classic mixed conditional she wants to express. I suspect she wants to express something like, if I weren't afraid of spiders, I would have had a pet spider when I was a child. Or if I were taller, I would have played basketball at school, right? Or if I were French, I wouldn't have learned French at school as a second language, right? So I think she wants to express that, where it's a hypothetical using past simple to change a present condition. Whereas I think this example is actually an example of how natural speech sometimes doesn't particularly fit the rules, because I think the person in this example is saying, if I wasn't afraid, like, and then they're actually talking about the past. If I wasn't afraid, I mean, I was there on that cruise last week, and if I wasn't afraid, I would have done something. And they're actually talking about the past. They're not actually talking necessarily about a kind of intrinsic condition change, you know, like if I were taller, or if I were French, or if I were called Tom instead of Rich, right? Which is like this kind of timeless condition of me. Whereas this example seems like, to me, that the person talking is actually saying if they weren't afraid at that time in the past. So this is a bit different, actually. But hey, I've used terrible examples sometimes, so, you know, it's just a bad example. I don't want to pick on it too much.
past participle. And of course, if this sounds confusing, this topic is, we talk about this more in the course. Now, there are a couple more things that I wanted to talk about before.
One of the things I would say about the mixed conditional is, if you become very natural and you incorporate the use of second and third conditional, and you can use that naturally, the mixed conditional actually is very easy. Like it just comes naturally from being very good at second and third conditional. So you don't need to worry a lot about it, because it will just come naturally. Students start to do it without even really thinking about it.
Before we wrap up, I know your head might be exploding, but it's important. I would add them as bonuses here. Bonus number 1 is called spoken grammar. What does that mean? I know we've been learning all of the grammar structures, but sometimes you just have to forget about them to sound like a native. Instead of saying, do you want some coffee? You say, want a coffee? Right? Or instead of saying, are you ready yet? You can just say, ready yet? At advanced level, you need to understand.
Hey, ready?
You don't have to speak like that, but
This is how you say, are you ready yet, in natural, rich language. Ready? You ready? You ready? Not even ready, but it's you ready? You ready? You ready? You ready? You ready, folks?
You need to understand that people use those phrases and they omit grammatical structures that we're used to as language learners. And yes, if you want to sound more native, then start using them as well. And another bonus is cleft sentences. An example of a cleft sentence is what I...
This is cool, right? So what she was just talking about was ellipsis, which is how we drop words. We actually do that in informal writing. Sometimes you can do it in formal writing. And we do it in speaking all the time. So yeah, ellipsis happens all the time. And if you get a bit worried about that, you know, you find that you need to construct the full sentence and then take away the words, and then you finally have your natural phrase. Okay, just let go. Let go. Don't worry. Become like a parrot, right? When someone says something, you say it back to them. Just incorporate it. Don't worry too much about the rules of ellipsis. And then we've got our cleft sentences. So we talked about those the other day, didn't we?
I really like is chocolate. So
I was thinking about this the other day, by the way. Why is it that native speakers use so many clefts? And I guess it must be something about how our mind interacts with the language. Like, it just must be a natural way for our minds to formulate the structures is in cleft sentences. So yeah, I love cleft sentences, and I think they're a really important thing to get used to using. So, you know, what you really need to learn is cleft sentences.
So they're all about giving extra emphasis on something that you want to highlight in the sentence.
That's always what the grammar books say, that they are something you want to put emphasis on, blah, 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 blah. But to be honest with you, I don't know if that's true. I think we just use them. I think we just use them because they just come out of our mouths naturally, you know? So I think there's probably, this is just me randomly with some intuition talking about it, but I think that what cleft sentences are is they are a natural way that we express the language. The thing is that I don't necessarily think they are a way of putting an emphasis in a certain place. I just think that naturally we speak like that. And I used some examples just then as I was explaining this. So you can see that we just naturally use cleft sentences. And I don't think it's necessarily about emphasis. I think we tell people it's emphasis because it seems like that and it helps people understand it. But what you need to consider is that might not entirely be the case. And another thing to consider is, if you ask a native speaker, why did you use that cleft sentence, and you show them their language, I'm pretty sure that they won't say that, oh, it was because I was trying to emphasize something. I would think they'll just say, oh, I'm just trying to explain it, and that's how the words come out. So it's almost like the language has a rhythm, and cleft sentences go well with that rhythm. So yeah, I don't think it's just about emphasis. I think it's just a way of speaking.
Let's look at another example. Sharon's car got broken into yesterday, didn't it? No, it was Nina's car that got broken into. So we're highlighting whose car was broken into. Okay, guys, I feel like there is too much for a YouTube video. I'm gonna stop right here. Of course, this is not the whole list of things you need to know in order to become advanced.
All right, we're coming to the end. So I'll probably stop this in a moment and give my final thoughts.
And of course, the language is very nuanced. There are a lot of things that you're gonna learn. But all I want you to understand is that every level...
Hey, she just used a cleft sentence.
...gets more and more complicated. And in a nutshell, what you need to start doing is immerse it.
And another one! What you need to start doing is Do you think that she realizes that she's emphasizing certain things when she uses them? Or is she just using them because it's the natural rhythm of the language? That is my conjecture.
To self into language as much as possible by watching shows, read extensively, listen to authentic English, write emails, reviews, reports, whatever. Practice speaking and receiving feedback on your speech. Expand vocabulary and master those grammar nuances. Thank you guys so much for watching this video up to the very...
Hey, so I think that was good. You know, I understand the skepticism and criticism that people have about language learning influencers and so on. And, you know, when you come across someone with 9 million subscribers on YouTube, then you might start to think and worry about that. But I can't really argue with anything in that video, apart from a few minor points that I had to make at the end. So, seems good to me. Decent video. So, here's a question for you. So, I guess, you know, LinguaMarina gets the thumbs up on that video. I'm not saying anything about her other videos. And hey, there's videos that I've done in the past that I disagree with. So, you know, what can you say? I think what it would be an interesting question for me, do you notice the cleft sentence? What would be an interesting question for me now is that sort of analysis and reaction interesting? Would you like me to look at some others? And if so, do you have suggestions? And I think since I've given quite a positive review there, then maybe you could send me some videos that you are not sure about or you disagree with. I would like suggestions from very large channels, if possible. I don't want to necessarily excessively criticize someone with a small channel who's just trying to do something on YouTube. But anyone who's got like millions of subscribers, I think they can take it. So if there are any channels or videos you'd like me to look at and talk about, and I will give my own thoughts as well as my professional criticism. And we'll see where we end up with that. Now, that's if it's something that you've enjoyed listening to and if you think it's been useful for you. Zoya says, I like it. She gave good advice, and she's obviously advanced. I mean, I don't think I can criticize her English. There was someone mentioning that she makes mistakes or something like that. Well, I mean, first of all, everyone makes mistakes, including me. You know, I said that like I'm some sort of special person, including natives. You know, everyone makes mistakes when they're speaking. But, you know, I didn't notice anything there. It seemed like she has fantastic English. I don't think we always need to be very judgmental about people's English as non-natives. Although I understand that's not the marketing. I understand that learners always want the native and the pure and the natural. And, you know, I mean, I don't have the energy or interest to fight very strongly against that. But, hey, her English seems fantastic to me. So I don't have anything else to say about that. Thank you, Rich. So, does anyone have any questions? We've been going for an hour and 35 minutes. Surprisingly, I didn't expect a react to be something that goes on for so long. But if anyone has any questions that I can help you with right now related to what we've talked about with LinguaMarina's video, or just any things that you're dealing with in English, education, or life in general, then I will try my best. Native speakers speak without realizing, but there is clue of grammar. I'm not sure what you mean by clue of grammar, but yes, native speakers primarily speak without thinking actively about it. And this is modeled in the declarative procedural model of language learning, where procedural memory is accessed subconsciously and unconsciously. And procedural memory is the part of the brain which deals with habits, motor skills, and kind of inbuilt grammar. And so as non-natives, we can develop that part, but it requires extensive repetition with instantaneous feedback or very immediate feedback. So we need to do practice activities where we have immediate feedback on what we're doing, and that will enable us to develop this kind of habitual or procedural memory. It's the same kind of memory that you use to learn how to play a sport, how to dance, how to play a musical instrument, and so on. Sleepwalker says, Rich, what's the difference between I've made a lot of progress on this issue and I've made a lot of progress in this issue? Second one sounds wrong. I've made a lot of progress on this issue. I made a lot of progress in this issue. In this issue, yeah. I mean, not critically wrong. If someone's speaking, you wouldn't notice probably. But I think the correct preposition there is making progress on this issue. I see an Andalusian Moroccan background. No, I don't think I can't remember where I got this from because I've been using this image for like 6 years, but I think it's somewhere in England. I'm not sure though. Zoya says, do you agree that English native speakers are lazy at learning another language since everyone wants to learn English? Yes, that's true. It's not only English speakers though. So I think that the French also have a reputation there. The Spanish, to some extent, have a reputation there. And so it's not necessarily about everyone wanting to learn English. But I think that you can probably forgive English speakers for being extra lazy because there really is very little reason other than fun for an English speaker to learn English compared to other languages, right? Sorry, an English speaker to learn another language compared to people who are natives of other languages learning English. English is just fundamental, critical for everyone, isn't it? Even the, rubbish collectors in the Mediterranean need to learn English now, What does pass off as mean? It means pretend to be something and be convincing. So like if I try to pass off as a police officer, it means I'm pretending to be a police officer. And yeah, so something like that, Tetsuro. Where did you get it from? What's the context? Do native speakers often use future perfect continuous in spoken English, or just for books? No, we use it. Yeah. I'll have finished by 7 o'clock. Like, hey, Rich, when are you free? You want to go for a beer or something? I'll have finished by 7 o'clock. I'm working at the moment, but I'll have finished by about 7 o'clock. When do you think the preparations for the party will be ready? I think we'll have completed everything by Thursday, and the party's on Friday, so we should be ready in time. Yeah, we use it. Future perfect continuous. Absolutely. Notice how I'm using it though. I'm not using it like I will have completed it's like I'll have finished, I'll have done it by then, I'll have finished by then. So there's your phrase, I'll have done it by then. Like, learn that. I'll have done it by then. When? 7 o'clock. I'll have done it by then. I'll have finished by then. I'll have finished by then. I'll have finished by 7 o'clock. I'll have finished by tomorrow. I'll have finished by next week. I'll have finished by next Sunday. Learn that as a phrase. That'll get you into it, right? So then you can find situations to use that phrase, right? I'm still eating my dinner, but I'll have finished by 7 o'clock. I'll have finished by 5:30. Can you speak to me then? I'm going to have a nap, but I'll have woken up by 8 o'clock. So call me anytime after 8 o'clock. In general, progress on or progress in, what's the difference? All right, prepositions. Have we made progress on? I am progressing in English. I think as a verb, you can use progress in to mean that you're making progress in a certain domain. Like, I'm progressing in languages. I'm progressing in my life. But then when we have progress on, it tends to be more of a noun phrase, like we're making progress on our project. You get it? So it might just be more to do with use, Sleepwalker. In general, I wouldn't recommend learning such a limited phrase like progress on and progress in. I would look more at the full context and try to make a bigger phrase that incorporates that preposition into it, so it gives you a greater understanding of it. Also, something you should be wary of is the less common the phrase, the more flexible the preposition. So prepositions can be very obvious and fixed when it's a very common phrase, like I'm at home, right? Like nobody ever says I'm on home or I'm in home, right? It's I'm at home because it's a super common phrase. So that preposition is like concrete in our minds. But with something a little bit less common, a little bit more out there, like progress on, progress in, there's a bit more flexibility with that. Oh, that's fantastic, Jose. I have to say I kind of enjoyed it. I did kind of enjoy it. It could be Andalusian, yeah. I don't know. Additional examples of cleft sentences. We made like 1 million. Well, one example I could give you is this one. All you need to know about cleft sentences is we use them all the time. What you need to be careful about with cleft sentences is they aren't always about emphasis, in my opinion. The thing I'd say about my opinion is cleft sentences are one of the most interesting and fun things to use as a language speaker. So there's some cleft sentences. The classic ones are all, what, and the only, but you also have ones like the thing is, or you have it clefts as well, like it's the rain that I don't like. Don't you like England? No, it's the rain I don't like. It's not England. It's the rain I don't like, rather than I don't like the rain. It's the rain I don't like. Anything like that is called a cleft sentence. We use them all the time. Can you make recorded shadowing videos? I think I've seen people doing that. Is that where I have like a script and I read it out naturally for you to shadow? Is that what you mean, Pachu? Like I read a script and then you shadow it? I mean, I could, but aren't there like loads of those around on the internet anyway? Longer sentences with prepositional phrases. Yeah. You kind of have to start out wide, right? So you take the big phrase and take a phrase as big as you can that you're comfortable bringing into your language And then over time, you'll get smaller naturally as you become more comfortable with the big one. Weirdly, counterintuitively, that's what I think. So it says, I think that non-native teachers who've learned a few languages have an advantage over natives because they've been students of another language and are familiar with that challenge. I totally agree with that, Zoya. But in terms of marketing and jobs, it's much more difficult. So I totally agree with that they do have that advantage. But they also have the disadvantage that they can have a confidence issue knowing whether they're 100% certain about being correct or not. As a native, I can always just be like, no, I'm right. Don't care what the book says. You kind of have that power as a native. And I think sometimes non-natives find it difficult to get to the level of confidence to have that, which is understandable. It's tough. It's real tough. I tell you, if I had to be a Spanish teacher, I wouldn't want any videos on the internet of that. I'm happy to teach someone Spanish one-to-one in a room with no recording devices. Maya says, I have a question about the verb will. Heard the phrase, as you will know, and the second part of the sentence. But this will is not about the future, I guess, so what's it about? Yeah. So, this is like a will being used in terms of expressing my speculation or opinion. And in this case, I'm saying I'm certain. So when I say, as you will know, I'm saying I'm certain that you know. As you will already know, there is no smoking in the hospital. I'm certain that you already know there is no smoking in the hospital, right? So that's one way that we can use modals is for deduction and speculation. The more classic examples of this are like must, may, might, could, and can't, where we say he can't be a chef. He's never been to chef school. Or he could be a chef. He's wearing a chef's hat. Or he must be a chef. He's standing in the kitchen at the restaurant and he's cooking the food. So the classic examples with must, may, might, could, and can't. But you can also use will. And that's where I think this expression, as you will already know, I would definitely put already in there, by the way, is the way I think this is normally said. As you will already know, right, which is, I'm certain that you already know this. I'm certain that you know this. So it's modals for deduction and speculation. Remember, of course, that there are many uses of will. The future is only one of them. And remember also that commonly for the future, we use gonna and the present continuous. Is that it, folks? Hey, everybody. Thank you very much for watching today. It's been my pleasure. My name has been Professor Rich. Make sure that you smash that like button and hit subscribe. And if you'd like to buy me a coffee, you can do that down below the video. If you'd like to become a channel member, you can do that. We have a few channel members now, such as the lovely Sylvia. Thank you, Sylvia. Although I see, is your member icon still there? This is a different account. Sylvia has multiple accounts. Have a lovely weekend, everyone. I really hope you have a lovely, lovely, peaceful and happy weekend and a lovely and lovely, peaceful and happy week. And I'll see you next time. Bye for now.